One quiet evening, her loneliness met my honesty, and a single conversation changed everything. It started as an ordinary evening. I wasn't supposed to stay long, just drop something off, exchange a few polite words, and be on my way. But when she opened the door, her smile, gentle yet a little weary, made me pause. She invited me in with a warmth that felt natural, and before I knew it, I was sitting in her living room while the soft glow of a single lamp lit the space. The room had a lived-in comfort. A faint trace of coffee drifted from the kitchen, blending with the quiet hum of the night outside. I sat across from her, noticing how she tucked one leg beneath her as she leaned into the couch. It was casual, unguarded, the way someone sits when they're at home, not when they're entertaining a guest. Somehow, that small detail made me feel less like a visitor and more like someone she wanted there. Our conversation began the way most do, with small talk. I asked about her week, and she laughed lightly as she described the little inconveniences of her day. Her voice carried that low, steady tone that always seemed to fill the space around her. I found myself leaning in without realizing it, as though her words pulled me closer. But as the minutes slipped by, our words began to shift. No longer about errands or weather, but about books we had both read, the music we secretly loved, the places we dreamed of seeing. She shared things with a quiet openness, almost like she hadn't spoken them aloud in a long time. I listened closely, watching her eyes soften as she spoke, noticing the way her hands moved gently in the air when she described something she loved. At one point, I caught myself staring at the faint lines at the corner of her eyes. Marks of years lived fully, of laughter and tears both. Instead of diminishing her, they gave her a kind of beauty that was deeper, more human. When she noticed me watching, she tilted her head and smiled, and I felt heat rise to my face. To cover my nervousness, I stood and offered to refill her cup. The way she thanked me was so soft, it felt like more than just politeness. It felt like trust. I brought the cup back to her, setting it gently in her hands. Her fingers brushed mine, warm against my skin for just a second too long. It was nothing, and yet it was something. There was a silence after that, not heavy, not awkward, just present. A stillness that carried its own kind of meaning. In that quiet, I became aware of how the night outside seemed to fade, how the only world that existed in that moment was the one inside her living room. I didn't realize it then, but that was the start. That was the moment when an ordinary evening began to turn into something far more personal. The air between us felt warmer now, though neither of us had moved much from our places. She sat curled against the arm of the couch, one hand resting loosely around her cup, the other brushing through her hair as she spoke. I was leaning slightly forward in the chair, elbows on my knees, as if to catch every word before it slipped into the air. She began telling me stories from years ago, moments from her early marriage, light-hearted mishaps that, in hindsight, made her laugh. Her laughter was different from the polite kind she had offered earlier at the door. This one was fuller, freer, almost like a release she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. It started small, a soft chuckle, then spilled into a sound so warm it filled the room. I found myself laughing too, not so much at the story itself but at the way her face lit up when she told it. When I teased her gently about one detail, she swatted the air in mock protest. Her fingers grazed my arm just briefly, but enough to leave behind a tingling awareness. I pretended not to notice, but my chest tightened at the ease of her touch. It was casual, playful, yet my skin carried the memory long after her hand had pulled back. The more we laughed, the closer we seemed to drift, not physically at first but emotionally. The kind of closeness that made every glance linger a second too long, every pause between words feel weighted. She leaned forward as she shared another story, and I realized our knees were almost touching. I didn't move back. Neither did she. There was something unspoken in the space between us, a kind of trust that allowed her to be unguarded and allowed me to listen without judgment. When she laughed again, her hand rose instinctively, brushing against her collarbone, then settling on the edge of the cushion. I noticed how her shoulders relaxed, how her posture softened as though she had forgotten the walls she usually kept around her. At one point, I tried to sip from my cup only to discover it had gone cold. She noticed and laughed at the face I made. "You need a refill," she teased, standing before I could protest. Watching her move across the room, graceful, steady, the dim light catching the curve of her profile, I felt something shift inside me. She wasn't just someone older, someone married, someone unavailable. She was a woman, alive and vibrant, and for the first time, I allowed myself to admit how much I saw her that way. When she returned and handed me the fresh cup, her fingers brushed mine again, this time with less hesitation. A tiny spark traveled up my arm, subtle but undeniable. We both smiled, almost as though we shared a secret neither dared to put into words. By then, laughter had stopped being just laughter. It had become a bridge, carrying us somewhere neither of us had expected to go. The laughter faded gradually, like ripples in water after a stone had been thrown. What replaced it was quieter, heavier, but not uncomfortable. She rested her cup on the table and leaned back against the couch, her eyes lingering on the dim glow of the lamp as though it were easier to speak while not looking directly at me. "I don't usually talk about these things," she began softly, almost as if she was apologizing. Her fingers toyed with the edge of the cushion, a nervous habit betraying the steadiness she usually carried. I waited, not rushing her, giving her space to let the words come in their own time. She spoke of her marriage, not with resentment, not even with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet weariness. She told me about the long stretches when her husband was away, about the way the house felt too large, too silent in his absence. Her voice wavered only once, but she caught herself quickly, covering it with a faint smile. I listened, every word threading itself into me. I could hear the loneliness hidden behind her even tone, could see it in the way her shoulders slumped just slightly as she spoke. There was something raw about it, something so honest that it made my chest ache. She wasn't complaining. She was revealing. And for reasons I couldn't explain, she chose to reveal it to me. When her eyes finally lifted to meet mine, there was a depth there I hadn't seen before, plea almost though unspoken. I held her gaze, and in that silence, I felt something stir inside me. Not pity, not curiosity, something deeper. A need to protect, to comfort, to simply be there. I leaned back, trying to steady myself. My heart beat faster than it should have for a simple conversation. I told her softly that I understood. Maybe not the exact loneliness she felt, but the way emptiness can sit heavy when you have no one to share your thoughts with. She studied me for a moment, as if weighing whether my words were sincere. Then, slowly, her face softened. The space between us seemed smaller now, though neither of us had moved. The air felt charged with something delicate, fragile. Her hand rested on her lap, fingers curled loosely, and I found my own hands clenching slightly against my knees to keep from reaching out. The pause that followed stretched longer than it should have. We sat there, breathing the same quiet air, both aware of the weight of what had just been spoken. And then, just for a second, her eyes lingered on my mouth before flicking back up to my eyes. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but enough to leave me reeling. Enough to tell me that beneath all the honesty, all the restraint, something else had awakened. That night, vulnerability became a bridge. Not laughter this time, not small touches. Just the courage of being seen, and the danger of what that kind of honesty can lead to. Temptation has a way of slipping into the quiet spaces where loneliness lives. For her, the silence of the house had become too heavy, too loud in its emptiness. She had never thought of herself as someone who could falter, someone who would ever let her guard down. She was a wife, a mother, and a woman who held values close to her heart. Yet on that night, when the clock ticked slower and her phone lit up with his message, something inside her wavered. At first, she told herself it was harmless. Just words, just company. A simple way to fill the hollow of an evening that felt longer than usual. He made her laugh when she least expected it. He remembered small details she hadn't realized she had shared. His attention wasn't extravagant, but it was consistent, something she had been missing. With her husband away, she had grown used to silence where once there had been conversation. And now, in that void, another voice had slipped in, soft but persistent. She tried to resist it. Every part of her knew this was dangerous. She reminded herself of who she was, of the promises she had made, of the life she had built. But the more she told herself not to respond, the more her fingers itched to type back. The forbidden has its own kind of gravity, pulling even the strongest closer. And each time she allowed herself a reply, she felt the weight of guilt. Yet she couldn't stop. Their conversations became a secret rhythm, one only they shared. He spoke to her in ways her husband hadn't in years. Not because her husband didn't love her, but because life had made their love practical, routine, and predictable. This new connection felt alive, charged with a current she hadn't felt in so long. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a spark, one she both feared and craved. Late at night, when the house was still, she caught herself smiling at her phone, cheeks flushing at his words. She hated herself for it, yet longed for it at the same time. The tug-of-war inside her chest was relentless. The wife who wanted to remain loyal against the woman who wanted to feel alive again. Temptation rarely announces itself loudly. Instead, it comes disguised as comfort, as companionship, as laughter in a moment of need. And by the time she realized how deep she had already stepped into this fragile, forbidden space, it felt impossible to turn back. She wasn't in love with him. At least that's what she told herself. But she was addicted to the way he made her feel. Noticed, desired, wanted. And sometimes, those feelings are enough to blur every boundary you thought you'd never cross. The forbidden pull wasn't just about him. It was about her. About the emptiness she was trying to fill, the longing she couldn't silence, and the dangerous truth that sometimes, what we crave most is what we know we cannot have. Every story of betrayal has a moment when the unthinkable shifts from possibility to reality. A point where the line isn't just blurred, but crossed. For her, that turning point came on a night that began like any other. She had been restless all day, her thoughts constantly drifting to him. By evening, the silence of the house felt unbearable. When her phone buzzed, she didn't hesitate this time. His message was simple, almost innocent. "Are you awake?" But she knew what it meant. It wasn't just about being awake. It was an invitation, a question that carried with it an unspoken promise. They began chatting, as they often did, but that night the conversation deepened. They shared secrets, confessions, and vulnerabilities that neither had voiced before. The words grew heavier, more intimate, as though each one peeled back another layer of their guarded selves. For the first time, she admitted she was lonely. For the first time, he admitted he thought about her more than he should. And then it happened. A sentence that lingered on the screen like a flame waiting to be touched. "I wish I was there with you right now." Her heart pounded as she stared at it. She should have ignored it. She should have closed the phone, walked away, and reminded herself of the vows she had made. But instead, her fingers moved almost on their own, typing back, "I wish you were too." It was just a few words. Yet everything changed in that moment. No longer could she convince herself this was harmless. No longer could she tell herself it was only friendly conversation. That reply, so small in length, was monumental in meaning. It was her silent permission, her step across the line she swore she'd never cross. After that, the atmosphere between them shifted. Every message carried a new weight. Every pause between replies felt like holding her breath. Their words danced on the edge of confession and desire, teasing the possibility of something more. For her, the guilt was immediate but tangled with exhilaration. She hated herself for giving in, but she couldn't deny the thrill of being wanted, of being pursued in a way that made her feel alive again. Her chest ached with contradiction, loyalty battling temptation, love colliding with desire. The turning point wasn't about physical touch. It was about acknowledgement. By admitting she wished he was there, she had opened a door that could never truly be closed. It wasn't about what had already happened, but what could happen, and that possibility was dangerous enough. That night, after their conversation ended, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The weight of her actions pressed against her chest, but so did the undeniable warmth of the connection. She knew something had shifted, something irreversible. The turning point wasn't explosive. It was quiet, subtle, and wrapped in a single exchange of words. But sometimes, it's the smallest moments that alter the course of a life forever. Once the first line is crossed, others seem to fall with frightening ease. What began as messages in the late hours soon spilled into daytime conversations. She no longer waited for his texts. She anticipated them, checking her phone with a rush of nervous excitement. The boundary that once kept their relationship safe, guarded, and distant was eroding. The tone of their words changed. They still laughed and shared jokes, but now there was a thread of intimacy running beneath every sentence. He would compliment her, "You look beautiful in that dress," after she sent him a picture meant for casual sharing. She would respond with half-teasing words, but her cheeks would flush as though she were a teenager again. It wasn't just the words that crossed the line. It was how they said them. His voice notes carried a warmth that lingered in her ears long after they ended. The way he spoke her name made her feel seen, cherished, and desired, and she began to crave it. Slowly, secrecy crept into her routine. She silenced her notifications when her husband called in the evenings. She lingered longer in the bathroom with her phone. The house that once felt empty in her husband's absence was now alive with hidden exchanges. Every corner, every room held a new memory. Not of her marriage, but of this dangerous connection. And then the boundaries collapsed further. One night, during another late conversation, she found herself confessing things she had never told anyone. The fears she carried, the disappointments she kept hidden, the quiet ache of being overlooked in her own marriage. He listened, not with indifference, but with patience and hunger to understand her. When she paused, afraid she'd revealed too much, he whispered words that unraveled her defenses completely. "If I were your husband, I'd never let you feel alone." Her breath caught. Those words, so simple yet devastating, pierced straight through her. They didn't just acknowledge her loneliness. They promised something her marriage no longer did. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like if he really was here, if her life had taken another path. The emotional floodgates opened. Every message now carried an undertone of longing. Every glance when they saw each other in person felt charged, heavier than words could hold. They lingered too close, allowed their hands to brush when passing something, and neither pulled away fast enough. She told herself they were still safe, that they hadn't done anything unforgivable yet. But deep inside, she knew the truth. The betrayal had already begun. It wasn't about physical touch. It was about devotion, about the place she allowed him to occupy in her heart. The collapse of boundaries was not a single event but a series of small surrenders, each one justified in the moment, yet impossible to undo. What terrified her most wasn't just the thought of being discovered. It was realizing that she didn't want to stop. Morning light spilled into the room, soft and forgiving, yet it could not erase the heaviness she carried in her chest. The nights of stolen conversations and lingering touches had ended, not because the temptation had disappeared, but because reality demanded it. Her husband would return soon, and with him, the life she had chosen long ago. The line she had crossed was now etched clearly in her mind, a reminder of desires she could not act upon. We sat together one final time, in the quiet living room where so many small, charged moments had unfolded. No words were needed initially. Our eyes spoke the language we had both learned too well. The tension, once sharp and unrelenting, softened into something more reflective, more tender. I noticed the subtle lines in her face, the way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the cushion, and the weight of her sigh spoke volumes about the struggle she had endured. "I shouldn't have let things get this far," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. There was regret in it, but also a fragile strength, an acknowledgement of truth that she could not avoid. I reached out, placing a steadying hand on hers, feeling the warmth beneath her skin. It was the kind of touch that said, "I understand, and I forgive you, even if only for yourself." We talked then, slowly and honestly, about the feelings that had emerged, about the loneliness, the longing, and the unspoken connection that had grown between us. But we also talked about boundaries, about loyalty, and about the lives we were responsible for. It was a conversation heavy with emotion, but also with clarity. By the end, there was no anger, no shame intended to wound, only a deep understanding of the human heart's complexities. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. The last moments were simple. A hug, lingering just long enough to feel the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat. A cheek brushing gently against my shoulder. It was a farewell wrapped in warmth, acknowledgement, and an unspoken promise that the memory would linger, but no line would be crossed again. As I stepped out into the morning light, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and peace. The intensity of our connection would remain with both of us, but it would no longer dictate our actions. She returned to her life, her marriage, and her responsibilities with a renewed awareness of her own heart. And I returned to mine, carrying the weight of desire tempered by respect, admiration, and restraint. In the weeks that followed, we both felt the echo of that night, a memory tinged with longing, but also with gratitude for the honesty we had shared. It was a story not of betrayal in action, but of the quiet truths that can exist in human connection. The recognition of attraction, the temptation of what is forbidden, and the ultimate choice to honor what truly matters. The aftermath was not marked by scandal, but by growth. By the end, both of us had learned something essential about ourselves. That even in moments of temptation, one can choose integrity over indulgence, and that sometimes the deepest connections are those felt quietly, in memory, without ever needing to cross the final line. Witness the night where a single conversation blurred the line. Watch the full story now and feel every forbidden moment. 6.